Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Thursday, February 13th, 2025. I am John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary Magazine. With me, as always, executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Social commentary columnist Christine Rosen. Hi, Christine.
Hi, John.
And Washington commentary columnist Matthew Continetti. Hi, Matt.
Hi, John.
I'm having trouble speaking the English language today, so I may have to forbear and have you guys discuss the epical news yesterday about Ukraine, Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin having a 90-minute phone call, both doing readouts afterwards that made it clear that they were very much in harmony about the need to end the war. And Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary in Germany, saying that it was unrealistic for Ukraine to expect to return to pre-war borders. The administration, therefore, violating Trump's own negotiating principle, which is that it seems to be negotiating with itself on just how far it's willing to go to essentially take Putin's side in the war. Is that an unfair characterization, do you think, Matt?
Yeah, I do. If I were the Trump administration, I would not have gone to Europe and say, Ukraine's never going to recover its 2014 borders. Ukraine's never going to be a member of NATO. But even if I wouldn't have said that out loud, everyone in the room would have thought it. So what Pete Hegseth really did in going to Europe was make the subtext text. He said what everyone is thinking out loud. And when you look at, say, David Ignatius's column in the Washington Post today, you find other parts of the speech that were not the headlines that actually gave the Ukrainians some confidence that they are not being thrown overboard just yet. And what are those signs of confidence? One is the idea of a demilitarized zone along the current line of control that would be backed by peacekeeping forces. Now, again, because of America First, Hegseth went out of his way to say there would be no Americans involved in this peacekeeping force, and this would not be a NATO mission because they don't want the Article 5 clause to be triggered if the peacekeeping forces come under attack. However, from the Ukrainian standpoint, that would be a sign of confidence in Ukraine because it would involve some type of security guarantee. Now, the outstanding security guarantee that the Ukrainians would like is the idea that America would support the peacekeeping force should it come under attack. And that might end up not being the case. But I think that everyone went to the headline here, which was the quiet part out loud, and which is disappointing for many of Ukraine supporters, including myself. But it is also something of a reality we'll have to face. Just one more thing on the Trump-Putin call. Trump is now the fifth consecutive president to want to begin his presidency repairing relations with Russia. And it always fails. By the time Trump was president and having launched into his good relationship with Russia, or trying to, he was, of course, hampered by the Russian collusion scandal. Then he had the disastrous meeting with Putin at Helsinki. And then by the end of his term, he was actually quite adversarial toward Russia. And when you consider the weapons that were flowing to Ukraine, the fact that our forces destroyed a Wagner Group brigade in Syria in 2018. So I have a feeling that this is going to work out the same way. And in fact, if I were MAGA, I'd be a little bit worried because the last time we were talking about European peacekeeping forces in the Balkans, America ended up becoming involved.
That was 1998, of course. Okay, I'm gonna bite back at you because the issue that I'm going with here is not that Hegseth didn't say the quiet part out loud. That's fine. I actually don't like the idea of stringing along policies when the policies are no longer extant. There was a moment in 2002 when the George W. Bush administration decided to announce, to end the fiction and say that North Korea actually had gone nuclear. And the world greeted this with horror, because the idea is don't acknowledge that they've gone nuclear, because then that means you have to sort of devise policies to deal with the fact that it's gone nuclear, which was true, but it's also has we shouldn't be lying or misleading people. And if you genuinely believe that this war is a disaster and should be ended, and as Trump says, he just doesn't like to see people dying, he wants to stop people dying, then fine. What you shouldn't be doing is negotiating the terms of Ukraine's surrender for Russia in public before Russia, Ukraine, the United States, the Europeans who are like actually at the negotiating table. It's a very peculiar way of going about things. It's not right, and there's an interesting aspect to the response yesterday. I noted among MAGA types and sort of peaceniks who have never been enthusiastic, to put it mildly, about our involvement in the war on Ukraine's side, which is that a lot of it seemed aimed at neocons. It's a lot of like, you see, we always said this war was never going to work, and I hope you all are happy now. It's been 3 years. It'll be 3 years next week that the Russians invaded. And I hope you're all happy now, because we were right. This war had no purpose, and it should never have, and so we're right and you were wrong. Well, okay. So let's rewind the tape to February 2022, and Russia invades Ukraine with no casus belli whatsoever. And we don't intervene, or the initial invasion goes really well. Let's just say the tanks don't bog down in the mud. The Ukrainians don't respond. Zelensky actually gets on the plane to leave to exile instead of staying and saying, "I don't need a ride. I need weapons." Russia would have taken over Ukraine. I mean, Russia would have, rather than spending 3 years in a grinding battle that has weakened Russia, which we should want, and has shown the world that aggression of this sort should and can be met with extraordinary resistance, we would be in a much less safe place than we are. We're not in a particularly safe world now, don't get me wrong, but at the very least, this idea that MAGA has, that they're triumphing now because they were right, that this was always a mistake. Our involvement in this was always a mistake. Our involvement with this is a mistake only in the sense that we did it badly. We did not give enough support to Ukraine to help it win. We gave it enough support so that it should be in this position of extraordinary World War I style stalemate with Russia, where Russia does have a bunch of Ukrainian territory, a little bit of Ukrainian territory, has won since 2022, and Ukraine has a bit of Russian territory, which it has seized and taken literally to have a negotiating chip when you get to negotiations, because there can be land swaps. We'll give you back your strip, you give us back our strip, and we'll go back to where we were.
Well, that's what Zelensky is saying. I mean, it's 3 different positions. The United States set out its position yesterday. Zelensky seems open to it. For a variety of reasons. I mean, they have
what choice does he have?
Yeah, they have this huge manpower deficit. Is the fact of the matter. The war is grinding on Ukrainians, and yes, what choice does he have? He's very reliant on the aid from the United States and, to a far lesser degree, Europe. But then there's Russia, and I think you're right to bring up the initial invasion, because what were Putin's war aims? Certainly, he wanted to seize the eastern parts of Ukraine that are culturally closer to Russia, let's say, and where he had been financing this low-grade insurgency since 2014. But he wanted to topple the government. He wanted what he calls the denazification of Ukraine. Essentially, wants to turn Ukraine into a neutral state. and he wants to be able to control it, just like he controls Georgia, the Republic of Georgia, and to a greater extent, or it's a slightly different relationship, how he controls Belarus. So, if the Trump plan is actually the settlement, Putin doesn't get what he wants, right? He gets what he controls now. He gets an end to the war and the potential to restock. But the Zelensky government is in place. Um, there is a free Ukraine that has the potential. By the way, so NATO's left out, but the European Union was not mentioned in this speech.
We should explain this maybe to people who don't.
Sure.
So, since 2004, actually since 1993, when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, on the table, in theory, in the future, there have been two possible carrots for Ukraine if it is if it's like a good actor on the world stage. One, membership in the European Union, and second, membership in NATO. So that's actually been more than 30 years since that has been on the table.
Well, the EU for sure. I mean, NATO, of course, was proffered in 2007,
Right.
along with Georgia, this idea of a potential member action plan for Ukraine and Georgia, which in a way set the ball rolling for the conflict we have today. And just finally, if the Trump settlement's enacted, or what we can glean from it based on these initial comments, there would be a European troops along with the Ukrainian military, which is still now the largest military on the continent, right? Yeah. So other than Russia's.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure Putin is going to see this as a win if this is what they get to, or even if it's possible to get to a place where we consider it a settlement.
But he did get the deference from Trump that he desired. That the call first went to Putin, and it did and then later in his Truth Social post, Trump said, "I will inform Zelensky of our conversation," very much sidelining Zelensky in negotiations about the war that he is overseeing, and helping his people. I just found the contrast. We were talking the other day about how Trump spoke about Hamas, and I find the contrast in the way his tone, his rhetoric, his willingness to talk about concessions in advance of any actual negotiation with Putin, very different from his rhetoric with Hamas. Obviously, very different situations. But, we did just get an American hostage back from Russia. And I'm wondering, and I know that Zelensky is going to meet with Vice President J.D. Vance at the Munich conference this week. So I wonder if there's some behind the scenes stuff going on that we're not hearing about. I hope that's the case in terms of making sure Zelensky doesn't remain on the sidelines of some of this. But I guess we'll just have to wait and see. I didn't like how congenial the tone was that Trump had with Putin, quite frankly.
I mean, it depends on the details here. If the end to the war freezes what Russia has now of Ukraine, that's 20% of Ukraine, roughly. You could say Putin didn't win. He won 20% of Ukraine. He's expanded Russia into Ukraine. He has another. He's moved the frontier for Russian military forward. We had John, your sister Ruthie, on the podcast the other day, making a very poignant, excellent point about Israelis who don't want to stop fighting Hamas because they have lost loved ones in that fight and they don't want it for nothing. Ukrainians have lost a lot of people here. And I don't trust for a second that some future date Putin doesn't go for more and that the response to it will be wanting.
I mean, look, there's
particularly if America's not backing whatever security agreement is
the next
put in place.
Democratic president,
right,
is when he would go for more.
Yeah, but look, the other thing is Trump engaged in a pretty terrible moral equivalence yesterday, by which I mean he says there are too many dead. Just want to stop the kill. There are too many dead people. I mean, I don't want to be naive or sound mushy or anything like that, but the way to stop the people from dying is for Russia to withdraw. Ukraine has no territorial ambitions on Ukraine doesn't want to fight a war with Russia. Ukraine is fighting a defensive war to save its country from being swallowed up by the Russian bear. And these are not equivalencies. The fact that Ukraine is killing Russian soldiers and that Russia is killing Ukraine soldiers are not equivalent. Ukraine would be happy never to kill another Russian soldier. The Russians are the ones who will not relent. And so Trump said Hegseth said it's not realistic for the world to expect that, Russia will withdraw from territory that it's captured. And I understand that as a great PowerPoint, or, being like a serious person in a dangerous world, working with bad actors. That is true, but we are at risk of equalizing a completely unjustified invasion of a smaller country by a larger and more powerful country solely because it made the miscalculation that it should go into Ukraine in the first place. And I do think it's a miscalculation. I think probably Putin thinks it's a miscalculation. I mean, yes, they've expanded 20% into Ukraine. This was not what he thought he was going to get. He thought he was going to get to Kyiv and take the country effectively, if not annexing it. But, ideologically, there is this entire movement inside Russia. We've published articles about it by Leon Aron and others. This idea that Russian civilization actually originates in Kievan Rus, and that Novorossiya, a project to return Russia to its roots, can only be done by swallowing up Ukraine. Ukraine didn't start this war. Ukraine has been astoundingly brave and creative and inventive and effective in stalling Russia or, denying its advance. And even if we are determined now to end this and move on, it will be a great moral stain against the United States if we allow history to somehow record that, there were these Russians and these Ukrainians and they couldn't get along, and then they had this big war, and then, Russia got a bunch of Ukraine, and, then things moved on. A world in which Russia had been allowed to swallow up Ukraine without any resistance, that's the second green light of the 2020s. That would have been after Afghanistan. That would have been just its open season on the planet Earth.
Well, and these are sorry to interrupt, but there are two sort of symbolic things that happened as well in yesterday's Russia-Ukraine news cycle, which is that Trump said, I'm going to meet with Putin. He didn't say where. He's not going to invite Putin to the US yet, but he's talked about going to Moscow himself, or maybe meeting on neutral territory. Again, bringing Putin back into the fold in the sense of treating him in a way not as someone who started a war against an independent nation, but, as someone he can negotiate with. And then Tulsi Gabbard's swearing in, where he was asked a direct question about Ukraine. Do you see Ukraine as equal player in the peace process, or some question like that? And he didn't say yes. He paused and he said, oh, well, that's an interesting question. We want peace. That is not the question of does Ukraine get to decide its own fate and future in negotiating the end of this war? An American president should say, yes, they are an independent country that has that right. And he didn't. And so, again, it's always a fool's errand to try to read tea leaves in the immediate responses of Trump to any press question. But I just found that particularly telling in terms of coming on the heels of his other statements.
I think we should just look at it from the other end of the telescope. MAGA wanted Trump to cut off military aid to Ukraine on day one.
Yeah.
They have no problem with Putin fulfilling his original goals that I outlined, or going into Kyiv and putting Zelensky on trial or something. Trump hasn't done that. In fact, my understanding is that the aid to Ukraine continues to flow despite the spending freeze. And interestingly, again, my understanding is that our aid to Taiwan is part of the freeze. Okay, so It's still going to Ukraine. We have Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, going to meet with Zelensky or officials in Ukraine to talk about this rare earths deal, right? Where Zelensky is like, sure, we're going to give you access to our rare earth minerals in order to make it attractive to you to continue to support us. And again, there's this idea that we're going to play some sort of role in backstopping or at least supporting the peacekeeping force. So if you are an isolationist, you're looking at this and you're saying, oh, gosh, I mean, this is just going to be a mess and a quagmire. It's not what we wanted. So I think that there's a way to look at what's happening and say that it's not a total abandonment. It's clearly not what people who would like Ukraine to recover its original borders and be independent and part of the West would want. But the only way, it seems to me, for Ukraine to actually recover some of this territory in the East, much less in Crimea, which has been annexed since 2014, is for America to intervene. And it's not going to happen. So you have to think about, well, what are the other alternatives?
I mean, look, the tragedy here, and we've been saying it for 3 years. We said it really after a couple of months that the war was in, when the United States started denying Ukraine access to the best weaponry that we could have sent them for the purposes of reversing the Russian advance.
Right.
And I mean, how often? 5 days a week, we do this podcast. How often did we say, why are they doing this? They say they want Ukraine to win. Why are they denying them tanks?
Every single system.
Right. Yeah. They denied them tanks. They denied them planes. They denied them anti-missile weaponry.
The ATACMS, then the limits on the ATACMS that eventually they lifted. But
yeah. But I mean, and so it would be a year until they would relent and say, okay, we'll send you some Abrams tanks. Okay, we'll send you some ATACMS. Okay. And it was always baffling, because there was this idea that we should back Ukraine, but we needed to be careful because Russia has nuclear weapons. And there was always a terrible confusion here in relation to this, because if Russia wasn't going to use nuclear weapons to begin with, Russia wasn't going to use nuclear weapons at all when it got bogged down. And we're designing this policy where we talk like what we want is for Ukraine to remain free and independent and return to its borders. And then the Biden administration was pursuing policies that made that goal, our stated goal, not Zelensky's stated goal, our stated goal, impossible to achieve, when not a single American soldier would have been involved. It was just weaponry. And what did Ukraine do again? Just, in the sort of annals of warfare, it had some, it didn't have much, and it started going crazy with innovation. These drone attacks, this, sort of all kinds of stuff that it sort of pulled off the shelf, or very cleverly handled. And at some point we're going to find out how that happened, or what the story there was. But it's not as though we were backing a kind of ludicrous third world army that had no shot. It was something else. And if we do a counter history again, where it's not that Zelensky is there and then we put our money where our mouth is, Trump may not have found himself in this position at all, because Ukraine might have forced Russia to withdraw. I mean, Russia has suffered insane losses. I mean, according to the Institute for the Study of War, I think according to them, 350 to 400,000 Russians have died. Soldiers and civilians have died in the war. Ukraine has a terrible manpower problem. I mean, we don't know what the death toll is in Ukraine, and I'm sure it's, horrendous beyond belief. But, we don't, the Ukrainians are amazing. Like, they've been amazing in defense of themselves, and they don't want to end the war like this. We're going to impose it on them. That's the oddity.
It's the entirety of it is a terrible moment for the U.S. because Putin had us paralyzed from the start, and he knew it. The Biden administration broadcast its fear of Putin and his nuclear capabilities from the start and continually. It's what Tony Blinken went out of office in his out of the government in his interviews, saying that his whole approach to Ukraine was balancing, giving the Ukrainians something without triggering these red lines. We essentially told Putin every day, "We fear you," and once he knew that, it was over.
So, I mean, Trump, the other thing is that this is elective in the sense that Trump didn't have to take this on as an early priority. He could have let it go. He did say he wanted to, he could end the war on day one. So I guess now that this is, week 4 and they haven't scheduled a meeting or anything, even, he didn't mean it, or he actually, was just playing rhetorical games. And of course he did say, and I believe this to be true, I think we all believe this to be true, that this war would not have happened had he been president in 2022. That now maybe it would have, because maybe he would have staged a terrible withdrawal from Afghanistan. We don't know what would have happened under those conditions. We really don't. He was the author of the Afghanistan withdrawal plan, the original determination to withdraw from Afghanistan. But let's assume that it had gone better under a second, Trump, if Trump had been reelected. There wouldn't have been an invasion of Ukraine. It wouldn't be on his plate. So, this is the what ifs here are just maddening, and this is a terrible tragedy that is going to destabilize Europe. I don't think it empowers Putin, because he's just in such terrible shape, and his military is in such terrible shape that our greatest fear, which would have been that he would have rolled up Ukraine and then started casting his eye on the Baltic states. That was the really challenging NATO, right? Really challenging Article 5 of NATO by going after Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, which are members of NATO, and triggering the idea that an attack on one country is an attack on all NATO countries. And then we really would have been in the soup. And I can't imagine that is anything that is a threat for, some time to come at a minimum.
But can we step back and look at what message Trump is now projecting to the rest of the world? Because I don't think it's necessarily, I share, we've talked for years now about the Biden administration's message of weakness that was projected around the globe. But the Trump message is, I'm going to end this war. I can stop this war on day one. He said it about the Middle Eastern conflict. He's now saying it about Russia. The idea of that I can stop a war, I want to end the war. I mean, that's a perfectly legitimate goal, but the means matter here, because the aggressor should not be rewarded with territory and no consequences and no threats of future security coming in and stopping them if they become aggressive again. What message does this send to China, for example, if they want to go into Taiwan? So I just don't want wars actually is an isolationist message. And the means matter now, because if he's trying to do some of this to satisfy his MAGA base, they will be quite satisfied if he can go around saying, look, I stopped all these wars, stopped the war in the Middle East, I stopped the war in Russia and Ukraine. What does that mean for deterrence to other aggressors? Right. We have enemies. And he is not treating our enemies as enemies right now. He's treating them as deal makers.
I do think that there are plenty of examples of Americans settling for half a loaf in conflicts. I mean, I mentioned the Korean Peninsula, which has been divided now for 72 years. Vietnam, of course, was supposed to be divided, but after Watergate and the Democratic Congress withdrawal of aid, North Vietnam took over South Vietnam. Iraq in 1991, we did not topple Saddam Hussein, causing over a decade plus now of problems. So I don't think this would be out of the ordinary if we somehow reach a peace agreement where Ukraine is partitioned, as much as I find that unfortunate. And I would just say too, I mean, this is Trump. He seems to me to be developing a view that there should be spheres of influence in the world. And we have our area, Neo-Manifest Destiny, Western Hemisphere. We're going to get Greenland. Canada's going to become the 51st state. We're going to take over the Panama Canal. once more, and that's that. And this is our, Monroe Doctrine, right? Europe, that's going to be Europe's problem, and Russia's, as he said, and again, I don't agree with it, but as he said, well, maybe Ukraine will be Russian one day again, or maybe it won't be. That's Europe, and that's Russia. And I do think Taiwan now is in play, from what I understand. That's because that's China, that's East Asia, that's a different set of powers at work. It's not ours. This is a very different view of American foreign policy since basically 1945. Yeah. I mean, I think Woodrow Wilson had a different global vision, but that was interrupted by the Republican era of the 1920s. So I think we need to begin thinking like that, and for those of us who disagree with it, formulating new arguments for a continued American presence in the world.
Well, Christine's argument is the ultimate argument. I mean, it's not rallying. It's not ennobling, and it doesn't sort of give us the sense of, America's great purpose. But at the very least, the idea that we need to stand for an appropriate world order, because the deterrence, what's going to be deterred if we do that, are the threats to our economic security and stability, and demands on us, if things really go haywire, that will be much more severe than we would wish that we could nip in the bud if we simply pursued policies of deterrence. America had this same fight after the Soviet takeover of Greece and Turkey, attempted takeovers of Greece and Turkey in the wake of World War II, and the division of the world into kind of these weird spheres of influence at Yalta, and the kind of the consensus position that was come to, that most people didn't really like, was deterrence, right? It was, very conservative people wanted America to work to roll back communism, and very liberal people wanted America to accommodate communism, or at least see positive aspects of a world in which progressive ideas of this sort were being worked out. And the America kind of settled on, it walked backward into deterrence and containment as the way we were, and it was very difficult, right? Because it ended up with mutual assured destruction, which was a very hard policy to kind of defend morally.
Two wars.
I mean, a lot of bad stuff happened, but you wonder, then you look and you see, well, the proof in the pudding is in the eating. The Soviet Union collapsed 42 years after George Kennan wrote the article that laid out this essential policy of deterrence in 1947. He was the director of policy planning at the State Department, a position. Now, this is an interesting point, because the director of policy planning at the Pentagon and the director of policy planning at the State Department, one at the Pentagon is going to be Elbridge Colby.
He's nominated.
He's nominated, and also nominated Michael Anton for policy planning at State, and they are both MAGA to the core. And here's the great challenge. So Elbridge Colby's argument, in a book he published and others, is we're being distracted by globalism because there's really only one threat, and that threat is China, and that is, we need to focus on East Asia and contain China, because that's really where our future danger lies. But if you push that argument with him and the people who have been advancing it, like saying, what are you bothering with this Zelensky nonsense for? Putin's not a threat to us, right? But then it's like, okay, well, what's your China policy exactly? What happens if China invades Taiwan? And they essentially say, well, if China actually ends up invading Taiwan, there's nothing we can do.
Well, but there's two other parts here. It's not just about aggressive military action by a perceived enemy or a perceived rival power. Globally, economically, this is the debate about tariffs. You actually can't be isolationist. And set that aside. Do you know what took us to foreign countries during a time of peace? When terrorists came to this country and started blowing things up. And that is unfortunately, when that happens, we have to respond.
I think that's an important point, because
Getting all
I
worked
don't
up. Sorry.
believe I don't believe that you can sustain America's global presence without a sense of direct threat to the American home.
Right.
And Americans hated communism. It was godless communism that threatened to destroy the world and religion and Christianity and everything, the family. And Russia got the bomb because of communist spies in our government. And so there was a dual threat that people felt, not just the Soviet Union was on the march and then China fell to communists, but also that there were communists within the American government and American society that were undermining this country. I think the lesson of the post-Cold War era is that it's very hard to convince the American people that America should be the global leader based on how well it performs for other countries or without a direct threat to the United States. So when 9/11 happened,
Right.
we were hit, we were hurt, and we said we need to go back and we need to invade Afghanistan, invade Iraq, and create this whole architecture to protect the homeland from terrorist attack. But as the sense of threat from terrorism has faded, in my view, incorrectly, it's harder to make that argument. And Americans do not feel a threat from what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. It's not on their radar. They
Right.
look at it, they say that's terrible, it's awful. Why are they fighting? I wish they
It
stopped.
is a hard case to
Yeah.
make. I mean, it's always that my point is that it's always been a hard case to make. We ended up in ancillary conflicts with the Soviet Union for 40 years, right? Korea and Vietnam, and other conflicts that we paid for, were sort of involved in, that we weren't directly fighting, Nicaragua, Angola, other places like that. And the idea is we need to counter their growth. We need to stymie them and, basically mire them in mud until, as Kennan said in his article, The Sources of Soviet Conduct, his famous telegram that he wrote to explain a new policy, they fall apart of their own internal contradictions. And if this is the reason I brought up Colby and Anton and their role in making policy at the Pentagon and at State, there was a misdirection here, because I don't believe that they're actually hawkish on China. That was part of the point that I'm trying to make. The credible threat to China of a worldwide response, should it try to take Taiwan, is very important. And if you start taking that off the table in your argument that we need to get tough on China so it doesn't take over Taiwan, there's something very suspicious making about whether or not you are advancing that argument in good faith, or whether we're just trying to say, don't get involved over here in Ukraine. We got bigger fish to fry over here. And the problem is that foreign policy of this sort, that is intended, as I say, to head bad things off at the pass, as Christine would say, it's not that popular. I mean, it never was. It can't be. Yeah, because as Matt says, like, what's the direct threat to us? And we have a real problem articulating the direct threat from China. We do it in this weird piecemeal way. On the one hand, we are incredibly involved to the extent that we can be in the Chinese economy. And yet now we have these tentative steps against China's influence, right? The TikTok ban, and to talk about how we need a foreign policy to be recalibrated and focused on the Far East in order to counter China's influence. But yeah, I don't think the American people feel a threat from China either.
No. But I do think they still feel a threat. There is still a threat from radical Islam. I mean, that's a funny thing. There is a division here between all these theaters and the Middle East. And where is Donald Trump finding the most support in this country? It's for his pro-Israel policy, right? Maybe people aren't the full, Mara Gaza. We haven't gotten the polling on that yet, as much as I think the idea is pretty attractive. But they do like the fact that Trump is supporting Israel. Trump lifted the Biden-imposed restrictions on weapons to Israel. And I think there is still a lot of memory there from what happened in 9/11. You talk about the Cold War, you have 30 years, and it's not present in people's heads. And China is completely different. I mean, they love TikTok, and and many people went to China when it was still a thing you could do.
Yeah.
And so I think we'd have to recognize that we're in this different world now.
But it's
And what Trump is pushing for is something very unusual for us, for people of a certain age who can harken back to the older frameworks that dominated the world.
But not even COVID, has stirred up.
COVID weirdly. Well, but also that was that was liberal censorship,
right,
and a denial to even say that China was somehow behind it.
Yeah,
but there's another strain here that I think we have to consider, and that's that unlike during the Cold War, where a majority of Americans, regardless of party, had this sense of defending their own institutions, whether that's their own governments, their own. I mean, the mistrust, the level of mistrust, which is fueled not only by the progressive left, but by the MAGA right, the burn it all down, everything's corrupt, that affects a country's ability to actually have a sort of worldview, a sense of wanting to defend something deeply, uniquely American that's important in terms of also being a moral force in the world. They actually are quite cynical about, there's a strain of self-hatred that in their approach to our institutions that's very damaging, that can lead to a lot of, disruption and shakeup that we're seeing now with what's going on. But that I worry what replaces, if you really think that everything's corrupt and you want to burn all down in your own country, what are you replacing it with? What is the message in terms of institutions? What's worth protecting?
That is the question of our time. And so go back to 1972, and that was the argument of the Democratic Party in 1972 with George McGovern as the leader of the party was "Come home, America." Now it was quite a beautiful slogan in its own way, sort of touching. But of course, it's like, "Come home, America." I don't know what the hell we're doing over there, number one. And number two, everything is so garbagey here. And this country is in such terrible, rotten condition, and it's doing the wrong things everywhere. So come home so we can heal. We can sort of like lick our wounds and sit together in the living room and sit Shiva for American ambitions. And America really, really, really didn't like it, as it turned out. I mean, it so didn't like it that Nixon, won 62%.
The more recent example would be Obama and nation building here at home and the removal of our forces from the Middle East. And what happened? ISIS came back. The terrorists came back. And Americans don't like terrorists. They don't like these crazy jihadists killing people randomly in the streets. And so, lopping off heads in Syria, which eventually forced Obama back in. I do think there is one potential danger down the road for the Trump administration is its policy toward Syria and our forces in Syria. And if we were to remove that, we know what the terrorists do. As soon as the pressure is off, they begin organizing and preparing. So that, I think, would be a place where all of a sudden reality would mug the Trump administration. But in terms of until China starts threatening to bury us like Khrushchev did, right, in the 1950s, I don't think the American people are going to have the same sense of threat from either China or Russia.
I mean, ultimately, the point about deterrence also is should fit with a certain MAGA conservative approach, because part of the idea is that it's cheaper. You see, it's that if we had given Ukraine the support that it wanted, that could end up being cheaper in the long run than the world destabilization represented.
A great point, especially if eventually we are forced into war like we were in World War II.
Well, that was the lesson of the two world wars, right? Is we pull out,
invest in deterrence rather than paying in lives down the road.
But emotionally, that's not how MAGA sees it. They see money going to a foreign country, and they see people at home suffering. That image, like you see people who can't pay their bills versus money sent to Ukraine, for example.
We had the space program, right? In the 1960s, it was the most wildly popular thing in the country. It was like visionary and exciting, and future. And there were like terrible sacrifices, form of astronauts' lives and things like that. And then the mission was fulfilled. We got to the moon by the end of the decade, as John F. Kennedy had proposed we do in the first months of his administration. And then the entire country went, okay, That's it. Like now you're going up and getting more rocks. Like what are you doing? If you don't say now we have to go to Mars, or we're going to build a colony, or we're going to do something to advance this,
Well, the shuttle
that's
program was no. The shuttle program
well,
was an
that was
effort.
the shift. No,
Yes.
it was an effort. But I'm saying they canceled the last two Apollo missions. I mean, so I only bring this up to say that you're right, that if 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 you need a cause, that was the thing that Biden did that was so crazy in Ukraine, which is that he said, this is a cause, this is Europe. We need democracies to come together. We need to retard this terrible destabilizing effect. No, you can't have ATACMS. No, you can't have our tanks. You'll use 30-year-old European tanks, and that should be good enough for you because we have other fish to fry.
And then he played a sort of shell game with it, because then, as it became clear that both sides were bogged down there, Biden sort of focused on, well, NATO has never been stronger. That became the accomplishment.
Yeah. And that is a big thing, because while for people like us thinking, well, look at NATO, it's the greatest, it's the most successful foreign policy alliance in the history of the world. It's lasted 80 years. If we go through sort of European history, there were triple ententes and double ententes and this, that, and Austro-Hungary is making deals with so-and-so, and all of those last like 20, 30 years. And then there's a giant conflagration. NATO's lasted 80 years. It has kept the peace in a place that was a sinkhole of violence for a millennium, and led to these two, ghastly near civilization ending world wars. And it did this work. And so, but it's 80 years since NATO was set up, and saying to people, it's so important. It's really important. Boy, is it important. And then they're like, why? And people knew why after World War II. Everybody had a relative who died in World War II. Everybody understood, or not everybody, but people who needed to understood. And as you say, like, it's not a commonsensical argument. That's why I go to the cheapness thing. It's like NATO is cheaper. And what's more, the expansion of NATO and what happened after the Cold War, the fact that we were able to withdraw so many forces from Europe after the Soviet Union fell, that that our military budget essentially declined by 50%, our military personnel declined by 2/3, and all of that because we were no longer facing this direct threat. And so you could even say there, because we have this alliance, we were also able to draw down when we could draw down. But yeah, like if you're 25 years old, if you're 25 years old, you were born in the year 2000, it's like none of that means anything to you. You don't even remember that NATO retarded a genocidal regime in the Balkans.
And the people who loom most and largest in your political imagination are the pink-haired ladies who want to tell you, what words you can use, and that you're a racist, and that trans rights are human rights. I mean, they're not thinking, that's what's at the radar. That's what's central on the radar screen, not this conflict in Ukraine. And look, I'm saying all of this as someone who believes America should support Ukraine. Yeah. But I also think we have to recognize the political realities facing us in the beginning of Trump's second term.
Right.
It's also an indictment, not to get on this soapbox that I stand on for decades, but it's an indictment of the way we teach history, not only the history of our own country and its role in the world, but in global history, which very few American high school students graduate from high school knowing anything about.
Absolutely.
That is bad on us. We need to educate our citizens better in terms of global affairs.
I think, if what we were talking about, what happens after you do the demolition project. And the truth is, no one knows. Something's going to emerge. I thought it was very interesting that Trump wanted to swear in Tulsi Gabbard himself.
Though he forgot to do
it. He forgot to do it. He wanted what he wanted. But what he definitely wanted was to be seen with her after the vote.
Right.
And you have to ask, what is that about? I mean, it is about the deep state and how Trump is just dead set on uprooting the intelligence community.
Yeah.
But it's also about the Trump coalition, that to his mind, Tulsi Gabbard and RFK represent these elements that were not Republican and that only Trump could integrate into the party. So he wanted to show that. So to me, whatever comes next is going to have some of that flavor, and it's not going to be comfortable, but it is a sign of where things are headed.
I mean, one thing that occurs to me is you're bringing up how he is moving toward a spheres of influence foreign policy, right? That which is, I mean, pre-modern is not the right word, but I mean, I don't know what you would call it, sort of pre
19th century stuff.
Yeah. And similarly, people may be wildly overreading the meaning of RFK and Tulsi's appointments, and maybe I did too, but sort of the whole, and this whole, he's a Nazi, the Nazis are coming, and this is authoritarianism, and he's gonna try to, seize a third term and all of that. What if he's a relatively simple politician, and what he thinks is that marshaling the RFK forces and the Tulsi forces gave him 3 or 4% of the vote, and that he wants that coalition, and that is like old-timey that is like
boss politics,
captain politics. Give them jobs, give other people jobs. They'll be loyal to you because that's what patronage is for, and B, like, you're trying to bring them into your tent and be your troops and all of that.
This is where, I'm sorry to interrupt, but this is where his vanity might be his undoing down the line. As Matt says, we'll just have to watch and see. But he's doing the same thing with the tech bros. And the idea that, oh, look, I'm bringing in all these people who weren't part of our coalition, and now I'm stronger and better for it, assumes that they don't have their own agendas that they will actively be pursuing under his nose while he pats himself on the back for bringing them into the tent. And that's actually where I do have some concern about how the people he's appointing at the lower levels will monitor what those guys are doing. And even to the point of Tulsi, like she might be a loyalist personally to Trump right now, but what is she loyal to in terms of values, in a sense of what her job is directing national
I just wish I could be there for the first Tulsi Gabbard presidential daily brief when she says, "Aloha, Mr. President."
Yeah.
Today, the spirit of aloha greets you as we survey the scene of threats to the United States.
I mean, look, all I'm saying here is that he's a very interesting, unexpected, and wildly unprecedented political force, but he is adopting ideas and tactics that we should be able to understand better than we do. And people go to the least or the wildest analogies. He could just, look,
they're just very old. Stuff, they're old categories.
Right. Yeah. But the deep state stuff is as simple as, look, I'm coming into this company, and everybody in it is loyal to the previous regime, and I did a hostile takeover, and they're all on the other side. They want us to be, building, they want they're Anheuser-Busch, and they want Dylan Mulvaney to remain the spokesman for Bud Light.
Or they try to...
I'm the new CEO, and I want to have, Shane Gillis or, Nate Bargatze as my spokesman for Bud Light, and I got to get rid of them because they're going to try to gum up the works.
Or the last time I was CEO, they tried to kick me out of the director's chair by saying I was an agent of a foreign power.
Yeah, right.
And so now I'm CEO again, and I want to get rid of all of them. That's why I think right now his interests align with the Doge, because he doesn't trust anybody in the bureaucracy. That's clear. Yeah. And so if they fire everybody, it's fine by him.
But this is the tension. This is the tension. That impulse, which I think Matt's described accurately, is in direct conflict with his manifest destiny approach to the rest of the world, which he mentioned. He used these phrases in his inaugural address. That requires inspiring your own population to understand your vision and help you pursue it. And that is in tension with everything is corrupt. They try, there is a lot of tension.
There is no way he would ever inspire the bureaucrats at the Department of Education to get behind Neo-Manifest Destiny.
But all the attention is on what he's doing with the bureaucracy, and he has to inspire the people. It's the voters I'm talking about. Like, he's obviously not going to win over the bureaucrats.
Right, but Matt Matt mentioned something yesterday that is very important. We barely touched it, which is the inflation number coming in at 3%.
Yeah.
Chuck Schumer saying, "You see,
Oh, it's
Trump is
amazing.
causing inflation." Now, that's of course, was president for 10 days.
4 years of inflation is coming down, and what are you talking about?
Right.
All you vibe, you're all buying into these vibes, and now suddenly it's like, well, we just checked, and as of 8:31 a.m. on February 13th, the price of eggs has gone up, 0.3 of a cent. Right? What are you doing about it, President Trump?
Yeah. I bring this up only to say that, as Christine would say, you're talking about rallying the people toward the cause of manifest destiny. I mean, he needs to recognize, and I'm sure, by the way, that Susie Wiles does recognize as chief of staff, and John Thune and Mike Johnson recognize that their entire future stands and falls on whether or not the economy can heal and whether or not something can be done.
Number 2 issue that got him elected after the border.
Right. And so, and what's more, the border is the number one issue in part because the Democrats had completely left the field, right? And had literally nothing to say about it. This is, as we said again, for 4 years every day. People know when they're having that's what they know. That's, it's not, oh, we can explain to you that you think you're poorer than you were last year. You're not really. And they're like, don't tell me. I know that I felt better last year than I do this year, or that, or that it's harder for me to get through the week on my paycheck than it was last year. And there is literally no reason for the American people to have any sentimentality whatsoever about Trump and the Republicans if they don't have an answer to this, and all the talk about the bureaucrats and all the deep state rooting out and everything like all this culture war stuff, all of which I'm a big supporter of, whatever isn't going to make isn't going to make a dime's worth of difference if the country remains in a kind of weird static, frozen state, not able either to end inflation or to sort of retard it, and no real policy that's spelled out in that regard. Let's move on just for the last couple minutes. Hamas announced, has now made it clear they are going to release 3 hostages on Saturday. So all week we've been talking about this question of whether or not the war would restart in Israel or whether it would not restart. And now we're in this very peculiar position because Hamas said, we're going to stick to the original deal, having said they weren't going to release any hostages. Trump is on record saying, you release 76, all 76, or they'll be held to pay. And Netanyahu basically said, release 9, right? So Hamas has now come in with 3. The Netanyahu release 9 thing, fascinating sign that, Trump is now further out on a limb about this than Netanyahu, another sign that he's a very cautious politician and that people misunderstand him. I assume that the 3 is actually going to be sufficient to make this move on for another week, at least. There's only 2 or 3 more weeks, or there's only 3 weeks left of the ceasefire anyway. But who knows? I mean, everything is so wildly destabilized.
I share your view. I think the threats forced Hamas to resume. And we'll see the condition of the 3 hostages who are to be released. And again, if their condition is the same as the 3 last week or worse, I think there will be even more outrage directed at them. But it does seem to me to be heading toward an impasse at the end of this first phase. And no one seems to be suggesting what exactly should happen once the first phase ends.
No, Egypt and Jordan together sort of issued a kind of joint statement saying what needs to happen is, as you mentioned, a 2-state solution.
Right.
Which is like saying what needs to happen is for us to, settle on Neptune, Right. It's really, there's water, we could get there really fast and everything will be just fine. So that's yet another detail. Meanwhile, Israel is awash in slow moving, slow coming out details about what the hostage experience has been like. if you understand that the hostage experience has been awful beyond belief, I really strongly caution you not to read about this if you can help yourself, because it will haunt your nightmares and all. And you already know it's very important for people who don't know or want to close their eyes to it, and maybe they'll never look, so maybe there's no hope. But the political effect in Israel has this two-faced quality, one of which is, well, these people are barbaric, inhuman, evil monsters to a degree we hadn't even, and we thought that already. And so they must be destroyed. And we've got to do what we can to get whoever else is there out, because God knows what's happening to them this second. Like, I can't even think about what is going on, at 3:00 in the afternoon in somewhere in Gaza, and what tortures are being levied on the men who remain there in particular. So it's just a nightmarish situation. I'm going to conclude here with a quick recommendation. A very unexpected, really quite remarkable first novel that's really a memoir, but she calls it a novel, called Lion, by the British actress Sonia Walger, whom you may have seen on To All Mankind. She was Penny on Lost. She was the constant. Again, if you haven't seen Lost, you know what I'm talking about. She's a British, came to America. She's been acting here for 25 years. She got an English first at Christ Church at Oxford, and has written this novel, which is a memoir basically about her father, an Argentinian, glamorous Argentinian, wildly irresponsible, reckless, and somebody who was sort of absent from her life for long periods of a time. And it's just a beautiful, heartrending, very short book, beautifully written, beautifully rendered, about her life and her childhood. And it was published. One of the reasons I picked it up, because I was in a bookstore yesterday, is that I knew her name, and then I saw that it was published by New York Review Books, which is the independent publishing arm connected to the New York Review of Books, and that is a highbrow publishing line, and publishes very sophisticated fiction and translation and that sort of thing. And ordinarily, if you have sort of like a TV actress, that TV actress would have her novel published by a commercial press or some small garbagey press or something like that. And this is a very unexpected development, and it deserves its glamorous publication by New York Review Books. That's Lion by Sonia Walger. That's Walger, and a very, very moving piece of literature. So with that, we'll be back tomorrow. For Matt, Christine, and Abe, I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.